Hello Team Textiles, welcome back, our first video of the year. So in this one I'm going to go over manual colorwork knitting with you. And I specify manual colorwork. There's basically three ways that you can do colorwork on a knitting machine. One is electronically. If you have an electronic machine, you hook it up to your software, and the software puts the needles in the position they need to be in order to do the two colors of knitting. And then there are punch card machines, which if you have, they're great. And you basically have a pattern on your punch card, and then that again dictates to the machine. It puts the needles in the proper position they need to be in order to knit your two colors across. We're doing manual color knitting, color work, which basically means we're doing things the long, kind of harder way, but for a reason. So we will have to manually move the needles into the position we want them to be in to knit the second color. And the reason we're doing that is, like, in school, we're spending a week on this. I really want you guys to focus on designing and playing and experimenting, and punch card machines are great, but it does take a while to actually punch a new design into the punch card. So if you're ever doing production, or if you're doing a project where you have a pattern and you want it to repeat all over, then definitely you do your exploration. I would do my exploration manually by hand, figure out my patterning, and then I would take the time to create a punch card to do the actual project. So anyway, we're going to learn to do it manually. And I should also take the time to specify, when I say color work, what we're doing is we're taking, in one row of knitting, 2 strands of yarn, 2 separate colors, and we're bringing them across the knitting, one side to the other at once. And so some of the stitches will be knit in one color, some stitches will be knit in the other color, and whichever color is not being knit, it will float behind the other color that is being knit. So this is different from intarsia, where we see sort of large solid fields of color. And in intarsia, you would switch from one color to another for each field, and you wouldn't carry the yarn in behind. Okay? So with the knitting machines, with stranded, it's also called stranded knitting, stranded color work, you can only do 2 colors of yarn in one row. Okay, so you're going to have to excuse me. I don't have my usual camera, so it's going to be a little wobbly, but I just want to show you guys the setup of the machine and talk quickly about that, and then we'll actually do some knitting. So, okay, you can see on my yarn mast here, I got my 2 colors threaded up, and I know it's a weird angle, but basically you can see that one color is threaded up along one side of the yarn mast, and the other color is threaded up along the other side of the yarn mast. So they are separate until they get into the machine. When they come into the machine, you can see here, there's this little 1. So my main color, my ground color, is going to sit where we always put our yarn, threaded up as usual. And then my contrast color is going to sit here. So I have to make sure this little gate is closed. I'm going to try and do this one-handed. And then I pop that second color in here. So you do not now close that gate, because that will just kind of hold this jammed up. So you leave it like this, you trust it is going to work, and that's where the second color gets held. You do want to make sure your first row of knitting with the second color that you either tie this off on the clamp or hold on to it until you're sure it is well and truly knit in. Okay, so now let's go over settings. So on Carriage, you can see I've already knit some cloth over here, and I'll come back to that in a second. But basically on the Carriage, my Russell levers, we're going to leave them at 2, like usual, plain knitting. The cam dial is going to go from O, for oh my god, I'm knitting, to F, which stands for Fair Isle. On some machines, it's going to say knit in, or there's 2 little sort of overlapping triangles. It's usually here at about 4 o'clock. Obviously, this is going to be up. The thing that's also really different, so this is over here, the side levers, we're going to put them both to circle. I'm just going to replace this guy here and chat about this. Okay. In your manuals and a lot of instructions will tell you for Colourwork or Fair Isle knitting, it's usually called Fair Isle in manuals. It'll say to put your side levers on triangle. For manual knitting, so triangle would work for like your punch card. For manual knitting, we put them on circle, and it's just to make things a little bit easier. We're not really doing things the way, it's not the most efficient way of doing it. But basically, for being inefficient, we want to be as efficient as we can be. So if we put it on circle, that will make all the needles that are in D position will be your contrast color, and all of your needles that are in B position will be your main color or your background, which is our main is usually your background color. If you have them in triangle, it just reverses that order. So you can do it in triangle, but the ones you push out to D will knit as your main color, the one that's threaded into number 1 spot, and the ones that are at B will be your contrast color. Generally speaking, we're knitting more stitches in our main color than our contrast color. So if you put the side levers on triangle, you'll have more needles that you actually have to push all the way out. So I put them on circle so that that's reversed, and I have to do fewer manual handling of the needles, less of it. Okay, so I'm going to come over here. To start, I'm just going to do a really simple every other needle. I'm going to get my contrast color threaded up. And it really is as simple as knitting across. And that's basically it. There are, of course, other little things that we'll talk about, but this is the basics. So you can see that some needles are knit in white, some needles are knit in pink. Where there's a stitch in white, the pink is carried behind it as this little float, and then where it's knit in pink, the white is carried behind it as a little float. And the thing about the floats too is that it does it can add to like the warmth and insulation of your whatever you're making. You can, like traditionally, you would use even yarns, so 2 that are the same weight in different colors. But of course, just because things are done traditionally doesn't mean that's how you have to do them. So you can use like a fine yarn and a thick yarn, a superwash and something that's really shrinky, whatever. You just have to know that if you're using yarns that are 2 separate weights, your stitches aren't going to be totally even, and you'll basically kind of see some of those floats behind the fine yarn. Makes sense. Okay, so to come across again, I'm just going to do the opposite of what I did, again, every other needle. This is where like a pusher bar for doing these kinds of things can be really helpful. I just line it up with my needles, make sure they're all front. Make sure you're doing the right needles that you want to have out to D. If you push them out to D and then like, oh no, it's the wrong one, you have to use your transfer tool to get it back to B position. If you just pull it back, it's not going to knit. And if you leave it out at D, it's going to knit the contrast color. So these are great for like this kind of work, and you can get them with different configurations, like, 2, push 2 and leave 3 open. Also, if you're doing something that you're doing a lot of and it's very repetitive, you can make your own out of, find like plastic and stuff like that. Okay, just make sure you're not using something that's going to scratch the needle bed. So I'm going to come back again. And then now we'll just chat a little bit. One of the nice things about this is there's no rules in terms of where you have to place your stitches. So like with tuck stitch, you cannot have two tuck stitches right beside one another because they won't have integrity. With Colourwork, you can have 2 of one color beside each other, or like 5 or 8 or whatever. I could do vertical stripes this way, basically, by just always using the same stitches for one color. The thing that you do have to be careful of, though, is everywhere you have a spacing between pulling in your contrast color, you wind up with a float, right? So I'm going to do something a little exaggerated here. I'm going to do these 3 stitches in pink in contrast. I'm going to do this stitch all the way over here in white, and then I'll do my edge stitches in contrast. So when I come across, you can see, because I had so many stitches where I didn't pick up the pink, I have this giant float. It's not ideal. Depending on what you're doing, if you're doing maybe a pillow cover that you're going to be very careful with if you ever launder it, or a wall hanging or something, it might not be a big deal. There might be reasons that you're okay with that, and there are ways that you can tuck your floats in and secure them. But, you know, if you're doing a garment, I'm sure you've all been there. I try to get my arm into a sleeve. If there's like wide floats, it can really easily, it can get snagged on my fingers or my watch or my bracelet, whatever. And then it can pull, and that can make the stitch it's attached to basically disappear. It becomes really teeny tiny, and it ruins, you know, the texture or the tension of your cloth. So be aware of floats and that they're not great to have, but also you can, you know, with intention design with them. Traditionally, the face of the cloth is the knit side. That's where you see the stitches creating the different colors. On the back side, you've got all the floats, but if you like the back side, go for it. That can be the face of your cloth. Also, sometimes if you have too long of a float in between colors, it can mess with the tension of the stitch that you're just picking up that's attached to a long float, and it might not look great. So just, you know, as always, sample, practice, work on that, see how it goes. Okay, so another thing to think of, maybe I want to break this color work up a little bit and have some stripes. So both yarns are connected to my cloth over here, right? If I want to just make a white stripe, so I just leave my needles all in B, and I don't put any out to D. If I just knit across, you know, of course, this pink one hasn't been knit in anywhere. But when I go to knit again, it's got this giant float, right? Because it's going to be knitting from this direction. So I'll just show you. So now I come across. Watch the tension. So now I've got this float that is like the width of my cloth, and that's no good. So if I want to have some breaks in there in between my color work, there's some really simple ways that you can do it. Basically, I could just take my contrast color out of my carriage and then bring my carriage across and back. Again, things to keep in mind, if you're only doing like 2 rows, or maybe 4 rows if you have really fine cloth, you can leave your yarn attached, just leave it at the side of the machine, knit across, and then you come back, and you're coming back to the side where your yarn is actually attached, right? So then I can just thread it back up into the carriage, do my contrast knitting, and come back and knit. That's totally fine. If I want like 6 rows in there, if I just connect it through the carriage again, I'm going to wind up with this big loop at the side. So it's really best to cut the yarn, knit straight rows, rethread the carriage, rejoin the yarn. Similarly, if you want to do like 1 row of knitting, if you just really, you have to have that 1 row, that is what you need for your design, then you just cut your yarn, bring one yarn across, and then rethread from the other side. Okay, one other thing that I want to point out is using your edge stitches, but actually, before I get there, because I'm going to forget this, I do just want to talk about casting on. So when we cast on, we put all of our needles out to D, we knit across, we push them out to D, we knit it. We do that at least 3 times, depending on the gauge of your knitting. And that's just so you can build up enough cloth to hang your weights. If you don't do that, you don't have cloth to put weights on, and if you're trying to knit without the weights, it's really easy to drop stitches. So if you're trying to do Fair Isle from the get-go, or Colourwork from the get-go, if you're trying to cast on, but you've got your Colourwork settings on, it's not going to do it properly because you'll have your needles out, you'll have them all out in D position, so it will just knit them all in the contrast color, right? And it will carry your main color across with it, so that's no good. So generally speaking, you either plan to, you have a band or a border or whatever, and then you start your Colourwork further up once your weights are on. If you really want your Colourwork like right at the edge of your cloth, what you do is cast on with waste yarn, knit enough rows to get your weights on, put ravel cord on there, and then whatever cast on method you like, you just cast on top of the ravel cord stitches, and then because there's already weights on the cloth, because of the waste cloth you've made, you can just knit, just go straight to Colourwork. So this works for lace and tuck and anything as well. You just go straight to the Colourwork, and then when you finish your knitting and you take the ravel cord out and drop the waste cloth, because you cast on those needles, you'll have a solid edge. Okay, I'm going to end this video here. I have one other thing that I want to show you guys, but this is getting pretty long, so I'll come back to carry your yarns up the edge of your cloth and why you might want to do that. So anyway, I hope you enjoy Colourwork.